Someone is deeply in love with you, and the reason may unsettle you more than it comforts you. It has very little to do with who you believe you are. It has everything to do with what you awakened inside them without even trying. Once you understand this, it becomes impossible to ignore. Most people believe love begins with attraction, shared interests, good timing, or compatibility. Those ideas feel safe because they offer simple explanations. But the strongest emotional connections rarely begin in such logical places. They begin much deeper, in parts of the mind that most people never fully understand. Without realizing it, you stepped into a hidden part of their inner world. A place they had spent years avoiding. A place they had buried beneath routines, distractions, and carefully built defenses. You did not simply make them feel happy. You made them feel understood. That may sound beautiful, but it can also be frightening. When someone feels truly seen at their deepest level, something powerful happens. They do not just admire the person who awakened that feeling. They become attached to them in a way that is difficult to explain. The connection reaches beyond ordinary attraction and enters a place where emotions become intense, consuming, and difficult to control. Most people never recognize this process while it is happening. They think love is simply liking someone more than everyone else. But what is happening here is much deeper. You triggered a recognition inside them, a recognition of something they had hidden from themselves for a very long time. It was not something they expected to face. You became a mirror without meaning to. You did not perform for them. You did not carefully create this effect. You simply existed in a way that challenged their expectations. You showed them something they could not easily explain, control, or place into a familiar category. That is where everything started to change. For years, their mind had been protecting them. Certain desires remained hidden. Certain needs stayed buried. Certain truths were pushed far away from awareness. Then you appeared. Suddenly those walls no longer felt strong enough. What they feel is not simple. It is not clean. It is not fully conscious. It is a mixture of longing, fear, hope, confusion, and emotional intensity. You did not merely attract them, you disrupted them. And when the unconscious mind experiences disruption, it often interprets it as fate. The strange part is that you did not do anything extraordinary. You did not say the perfect words. You did not follow a formula. You did not intentionally try to make an impression. You broke an expectation. The human mind depends on patterns. It feels comfortable when everything behaves in predictable ways. But when someone appears who cannot be easily predicted, the mind becomes fascinated. You became unpredictable in a meaningful way. Not chaotic, not random, meaningful. You seem to represent something larger than yourself. That is when projection began. Slowly, they stopped seeing you only as a person. They began seeing you as an answer to a question they had never consciously asked, an answer to an emptiness they could feel but could never fully describe. Once that happens, the emotional connection changes completely. They do not simply fall in love with you. They fall into the experience of you. And that is why letting go becomes so difficult. Because letting go of you would require facing the part of themselves that you awakened. It would require confronting emotions, desires, fears, and truths that had remained hidden for years. The mind resists that process, so they continue holding on, even when it confuses them, even when it hurts them, even when it makes no logical sense. The unsettling truth is that you did not only awaken something beautiful inside them, you also awakened something unstable. When deeply buried emotions rise to the surface, they rarely arrive gently. They emerge with force. They distort perception. They blur boundaries. They create emotional intensity that feels completely real, even when it is not fully connected to reality. You can sense that intensity. You notice it in the way they look at you. You notice it in their reactions. You notice it in the strange feeling that something important is happening beneath the surface, even during ordinary moments. The complicated part is that they do not fully understand it either. This process is happening beneath conscious awareness. It is unfolding in a place where logic has little influence, a place where love and fear can exist at the same time, a place where desire and avoidance become tangled together. That is why their behavior often feels inconsistent. One moment they seem completely drawn toward you, the next moment they pull away. Not because their feelings disappeared, because their defenses activated. Something inside them sensed danger, not physical danger, emotional danger. The danger of facing a truth they are not ready to accept. This creates a cycle: desire followed by fear, closeness followed by distance, intensity followed by confusion, again and again. And whether you realize it or not, part of you can feel that cycle too. There is something different about this connection, something heavier, something more emotionally charged, something that seems to pull hidden parts of both people toward the surface. The moment this recognition happened, everything changed. Because what they recognized was never about your appearance, your status, or the role you play in their life. It was about what you symbolize inside their unconscious mind. You became connected to something they have been searching for, avoiding, and needing, all at the same time. That is why the connection feels so intense. That is why it feels difficult to explain. That is why it refuses to fit into ordinary definitions. You did not simply make them fall in love. You awakened something that had been sleeping inside them for years. And once something that powerful wakes up, it rarely returns to silence. It waits. It grows. It demands attention. And sooner or later, it forces the person to face what has been hidden all along. People do not fall in love with reality as often as they believe. Deep emotional attachment usually forms around meaning. It forms around symbols. And somehow, without realizing it, you became a symbol inside their mind. You came to represent something they lost long ago, or something they never received, or something they secretly believed they were never allowed to have. That is where this becomes difficult for them, because caring about you forces them to face a contradiction they have been carrying for years. One part of them wants to move closer, another part wants to run. One part feels drawn toward you, another part fights against that pull with equal strength. Not because they do not care, but because caring forces them to confront something they have spent their entire life avoiding. The conflict does not stay hidden. It begins to appear in their actions. You see it in their hesitation. You see it in the mixed signals. You see it in moments when they seem incredibly close, only to become distant without explanation. You feel the inconsistency. You feel the emotional confusion. You feel that strange sense that something is constantly pulling them toward you while something else is pulling them away. The truth is, they are not confused about you. They are overwhelmed by themselves. You activated a part of them that does not operate through logic. It operates through memory. It operates through emotion. It operates through desires they never fully acknowledged. And once that part becomes active, it begins demanding attention. Suddenly, old feelings return. Old experiences begin surfacing. Things they thought they had forgotten begin influencing them again. A deep sense of familiarity appears. A sense that this connection means more than it should. A sense that it matters in ways they cannot explain. At the same time, fear grows. The stronger the connection feels, the more unsettled they become. Their conscious mind wants certainty, it wants stability, it wants answers. But the unconscious mind wants something entirely different. It wants resolution. And resolution often requires confronting things that have remained hidden for years. That process is rarely comfortable. It creates tension. It creates inner pressure. It creates emotional conflict. Eventually, they decide they need distance. Not because they want to lose you, not because they stopped caring, because they believe distance will restore control. They convince themselves that stepping back will weaken the attachment, that time will calm the intensity, that space will bring clarity. But something unexpected happens. The distance makes everything stronger. Because when reality disappears, imagination takes over. And imagination is far more powerful than reality. Now you are no longer simply a person in their life. You become an image, a possibility, a symbol, a projection. You become connected to everything they cannot fully understand inside themselves. And projections have no boundaries. They expand, they grow, they become larger than reality, more meaningful than reality, more emotionally powerful than reality. That is why breaking free becomes so difficult, because they are no longer attached only to who you are. They are attached to what you represent. And what you represent touches something deep inside them, something they cannot easily replace, something they cannot easily ignore. But there is another layer to this. They do not trust it. They do not trust how powerful these emotions feel. They do not trust how quickly they appeared. They do not trust how deeply they affect them. Anything this intense feels dangerous. Anything this powerful feels costly. Their mind immediately begins looking for reasons to resist. Doubt appears. Fear appears. Second-guessing appears. Not because the feeling is false, because the feeling is asking for something. It is demanding change. And change is exactly what they fear. If they fully accepted what they feel for you, they would have to face every part of themselves they have been avoiding. Every hidden wound, every old disappointment, every unmet need, every truth they buried long ago. The mind does not rush toward that kind of confrontation. It avoids it. It delays it. It distracts itself from it. So they remain trapped in the middle. Wanting you but resisting you, thinking about you but avoiding you, feeling everything but expressing very little. The tension grows, slowly, quietly, constantly. It does not disappear, it accumulates, day after day, moment after moment, until eventually something has to change. Because the human mind cannot hold that level of contradiction forever. Sooner or later, the pressure becomes too great. And when that happens, the outcome is unpredictable. Sometimes it leads to honesty. Sometimes it leads to withdrawal. Sometimes it leads to choices that seem irrational. Choices that make no sense from the outside. Because when unconscious emotions take control, logic loses its influence. Emotion becomes the dominant force. And that is when everything shifts. That is the moment when they can no longer pretend this is temporary. The moment when they can no longer dismiss it as simple attraction. The moment when they are forced to acknowledge that something deeper has been happening all along. Whether they are ready or not. Because what was awakened inside them is not superficial. It is not passing. It is not something that disappears through avoidance. It demands resolution. And every form of resolution comes with a price. The question is not whether they will face it. The question is what they are willing to sacrifice to avoid facing it. At a certain point, the mind stops negotiating. Suppression has limits, and those limits have already been crossed. You can feel it in the silence. You can feel it in the pauses between interactions. You can feel it in the unspoken tension that never completely disappears. It remains there, waiting, growing, building pressure beneath the surface. Because what is happening inside them is no longer stable. The emotional weight continues increasing, and pressure always searches for release. But release does not always arrive in a healthy form. Sometimes it arrives as clarity, sometimes it arrives as collapse. That is what makes this so difficult, because what they feel is no longer simple attraction. It is confrontation. A confrontation with parts of themselves they spent years avoiding, parts shaped by rejection, parts shaped by disappointment, parts shaped by beliefs they accepted as truth long ago, beliefs that convinced them they were not enough, beliefs that convinced them they were too much. Beliefs that convinced them love was unsafe. Then you entered their life. And without realizing it, you challenged every one of those beliefs. You contradicted the story they had been telling themselves. You exposed possibilities they never expected to consider. But the mind rarely accepts contradiction peacefully. It resists. It fights back. It twists reality in order to preserve familiar patterns, because accepting this connection would require rebuilding the way they see themselves. And that process feels threatening. Not physically threatening, psychologically threatening. It feels like losing a version of themselves that has existed for years. So instead of fully accepting the healing, they split around it. Part of them moves closer, part of them moves away. One side craves connection, the other side craves protection. One side wants intimacy, the other side wants control. The closer they feel to you, the more exposed they feel within themselves. And exposure feels dangerous, not because of you, because of what it reveals. You have become more than a person in their story. You have become a challenge to the identity they created to survive. And survival identities do not disappear easily. They defend themselves, they protect themselves, sometimes aggressively, sometimes suddenly, sometimes in ways that seem completely irrational. That is why they create explanations. Stories that make the connection feel smaller than it is. Stories that make it easier to manage. Maybe it is temporary. Maybe it is nothing serious. Maybe it will fade. Maybe they are imagining it. But those explanations are not designed to uncover the truth. They are designed to contain it. Because fully understanding what they feel would require admitting that this connection is real. And not just real, transformative, more powerful than anything they expected, more meaningful than anything they prepared for. That is where the tension becomes almost impossible to ignore. Because no matter how much they analyze it, question it, or resist it, their deeper self continues responding. Their body responds, their emotions respond, their attention responds, and every attempt to escape the feeling only reveals how deeply rooted it has already become. Their subconscious does not listen to logic. That pull toward you does not fade with time. It grows stronger, quietly, constantly, relentlessly. Something deep inside them keeps insisting that this matters, that it is important, that it cannot simply be ignored. And the longer they try to ignore it, the more it begins to affect them. Not only emotionally, not only mentally, but physically as well. Because emotions that remain buried do not disappear. They change form. They become restlessness. They become anxiety. They become a feeling that something is missing, even when everything else in life appears perfectly normal. And somehow, you become connected to that feeling. Not because they want you to be, but because their mind has attached you to something essential, something meaningful, something they cannot replace with anything else. That is when the first cracks begin to appear. Small cracks, subtle cracks, moments when their control slips for just a second, moments when they almost tell you the truth, moments when they almost reveal what has been happening beneath the surface, moments when they almost allow you to see how deep this connection has become. Then they pull back, even harder than before, because now the fear has changed. They are no longer afraid of you. They are afraid of themselves, afraid of how much they feel, afraid of how little control they actually have. And that fear creates a cycle that becomes more unstable with time. The closer they move toward you, the more exposed they feel. The more exposed they feel, the more they panic. The more they pull away, the stronger the attachment becomes. And eventually, that cycle begins wearing them down. Not on the outside. On the outside, they still seem calm. They still seem composed. They still appear capable of managing their life. But inside, there is chaos. Because you have become a contradiction they cannot solve. They want you, but wanting you feels dangerous. They feel connected to you, but connection requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is exactly what their defenses were created to avoid. Now they find themselves trapped between opposing forces, between desire and fear, between honesty and denial, between stepping forward and running away. Most people never realize what is actually happening here. This is not only emotional tension, it is identity tension. Because moving toward you would require them to become someone different, someone more open, someone more honest, someone willing to be seen, someone willing to risk disappointment. And that version of themselves feels unfamiliar, unstable, even threatening. Yet moving away does not solve anything. The feelings follow them, quietly, constantly, like a shadow they cannot escape. What begins as longing slowly transforms into regret. What begins as avoidance slowly transforms into questions. Questions that refuse to disappear. Questions about what might have happened. Questions about what might still happen. Questions about whether they are walking away from something real. And those questions begin creating their own kind of pain. Because now there is no comfortable choice, only different forms of discomfort. They can face what they feel, or they can spend years trying to outrun it. But forgetting is not as easy as they imagined, because you are no longer simply a memory. You have become part of their inner world, part of their emotional landscape, a symbol, a trigger, a reminder of something they still cannot fully explain. The harder they try to suppress it, the more it returns. It appears in unexpected moments, in quiet evenings, in random thoughts, in dreams, in brief flashes of memory, in moments when the world grows silent and their attention drifts back to you, again and again. And that is when the pressure reaches its highest point, because the human mind can only tolerate so much contradiction before it demands resolution. Eventually, something has to change, something has to be acknowledged, something has to be faced. But resolution rarely arrives gently. Sometimes it arrives as a breaking point, a moment when everything they have been holding inside finally rises to the surface. A moment when restraint collapses. A moment when the truth becomes impossible to contain. And right before that happens, there is a strange stillness. Not peace, not acceptance, just silence. A heavy silence. The kind that appears when every distraction stops working. The kind that appears when denial finally loses its power. And in that silence, the truth begins to emerge. Not filtered, not protected, not hidden behind excuses. Just truth. By this point, they have already tried everything. Distance, distraction, rationalization, avoidance. None of it worked, because reality does not disappear simply because it is uncomfortable. And what they feel has become impossible to deny. Then they finally understand something important. The struggle was never about controlling the emotion. It was about avoiding what the emotion revealed. And what it reveals unsettles them. Because you did not simply awaken attraction. You exposed a hunger that has existed inside them for years. A hunger for connection. A hunger for understanding. A hunger for something genuine, something real. That realization changes everything. Because now the protective stories begin falling apart. The explanations stop working. The excuses lose their power. They can no longer convince themselves this is ordinary attraction. They can no longer reduce it to curiosity. They can no longer pretend it means nothing. One question remains. Why you? Why does this person affect them so deeply? Why does this feel connected to something larger than the present moment? The answer is not simple. Because what they feel is tied to unfinished parts of themselves. Parts they buried long ago. Parts they stopped acknowledging. Parts they believed would remain hidden forever. But the unconscious mind never truly forgets. It waits. Patiently. Silently. Until something reflects those hidden parts back to the surface. You became that reflection. You became the mirror. And the most painful realization arrives when they finally understand what they are seeing. You are not only reflecting who they are, you are reflecting who they might have become. A version of themselves they abandoned. A version that was more courageous, more open, more authentic. A version that did not run from connection. A version that did not hide behind fear. And suddenly, loving you becomes about more than wanting another person. It becomes about mourning that lost version of themselves. The version that never had the chance to fully exist. That realization carries enormous weight, because every step away from you feels like turning away from that possibility. And every step toward you feels like entering unfamiliar territory. A place where certainty disappears. A place where control becomes impossible. A place where vulnerability becomes unavoidable. Eventually, they understand there is no safe path, no perfect answer, no comfortable middle ground. There is no way to feel something this deeply and remain unchanged. Transformation has already begun. The only remaining question is how far they are willing to follow it. Because every choice requires a sacrifice. If they walk away, they lose the connection. But they also lose the possibility they discovered through it. The possibility of becoming more than they were. And that loss does not disappear. It lingers. It returns years later, in quiet moments, in unexpected memories, in unexplained feelings of regret. But if they move toward you, another loss awaits. They lose control. They lose certainty. They lose the identity they spent years building around safety and self-protection. And to the human mind, losing control can feel terrifying. That is why this becomes the breaking point. The moment when every defense begins to crumble.